Hello again, everybody in Humanities 105. I don't know how long it's been since you watched the last video, but for me, it's been all of like 3 minutes since I stopped recording the last one. But I will go ahead and pick up, carry on my train of thought, and we'll talk today, or not today, in this video, about the cultural aspects of understanding news media in the American media. Um, and this is a big, thorny, complicated topic that has an awful lot of ins and outs, and sometimes there's not even necessarily a great answer, or at least a perfect answer. But that's why we tackle these things, in order to open up those discussions. So let's start with the basic function of the news media in American culture and society. News media is supposed to provide a ideally unbiased account of information about current events, typically told to us in story format, not just pure information, but structured like a narrative. And that is much more difficult than it sounds, to put it simply. I often like to use an example. If you have ever witnessed something with your family or your friends that what you found to be remarkably crazy, maybe remarkably hilarious or something like that, your perception of that event was live. You were there when that moment happened. But any attempt to retell the story of that happening is inevitably going to be very different. Your friends might still laugh at your story, but maybe they're laughing at your storytelling as much as they are at the event itself that happened. And so that, I think, provides an interesting way of thinking about this, that reporters, editors, journalists, when they're doing this work of collecting information and turning it into narrative reports about what's happening in the world, they are transforming this information, these real events, into stories. And stories are inherently different than real life itself. They can try to be as close to real life as they can, but there is a key distinction. And I think that's worth acknowledging right at the top. Now, that being said, for many journalists, the first thing that they have to think about is what is news? What is happening out there that is actually worth turning into a headline, so to speak? And so the textbook actually does a very nice job laying this out for us. They have what is described as newsworthiness criteria. I believe there's 8 or 9 of them. We'll read them off really quickly here. But these are the different aspects of information that turns something from just an event that happened into an event that is news, something that is the public deserves to know about. So to run through them really quickly, and then I'll define them for you. These criteria are timeliness, proximity, conflict, prominence, human interest, consequence, usefulness, novelty, and deviance. So those are our criteria for newsworthiness. The more of those criteria a story meets, the more newsworthy it becomes, and maybe the bigger the headlines are, maybe the more attention it gets, these sorts of things. So to run through them really quickly, proximity just means how close is this event to the audience. If you are a local news source, the Chicago Tribune, you have to judge how much to cover beyond the Chicago metropolitan area. Certainly, national events and global events will be relevant to Chicagoans, hence why I'm talking about all of this from my bedroom and not the classroom. But you probably want to make a distinction around what you might call perhaps news that is not national or global, but just local in a different place. Do you care here in Chicago who won the mayoral race in Los Angeles? They didn't have one recently. I was just making up an example off the top of my head. But that's an example of a story that doesn't have much local relevance, and so it would not meet the proximity criteria. The next of these is timeliness. Timeliness just means how recent was this event? How new is this news, so to speak? The more recent it is, the more likely it is to be major news. Think of the coronavirus outbreak, obviously, is happening right now, and that is by far the largest story in the world. Whereas something like, we discussed it several times, the Democratic primary for the presidential contest this fall, it was 3 days ago, 4 days ago, that Illinois voted for who we wanted to be the next Democratic nominee for president. I do not see basically any discussion of that in the news media right now because, well, coronavirus has gobbled up all the airtime. So the next criteria is conflict. And this is a pretty basic element of any storytelling, but is there a conflict between two sides of an issue? Is there a conflict between, say, life and death? These sorts of things. The coronavirus would meet this because it's a conflict between life and death, but it's also a conflict between normal and abnormal lifestyles. There's also a political conflict that's wrapped up in the coronavirus story. So there's a lot of layers of people disagreeing or opposite sides of an issue in conflict. It's just the best way to put it. I'm sure that one should be pretty obvious. Prominence has to do with how well known the people or institutions involved in the story are. Something like, regardless of your feelings, anything involving President Trump will be extremely prominent news because he's the president of the United States and was a B-list celebrity before he became president. And he loves that. I think that's why he's president, in all honesty, was just for more prominence. But regardless, anything involving the president is going to be newsworthy. Anything in Chicago that involves similar elected leaders, they're prominent figures, celebrities, prominent figures. Stuff that happens, here in the city colleges of Chicago, I don't think I'm particularly newsworthy in terms of how important I am in the local news economy. Though I was talking to a reporter earlier, so you never know. All right. Human interest is actually one I always love to define. Human interest does not mean it's interesting to humans. It means that this is a story about extraordinary things happening to ordinary people. You take a news event and you give it a personal, often rather sentimental spin. So an example that you might have seen recently is any stories about particular people, particular families dealing with COVID-19. People who've fallen ill, been hospitalized, or even died. There was a story the other day, I think it was a family in New Jersey, where I think it's a family of 7. 4 of them have gotten COVID-19. 2 of them have passed away, but the mother, the matriarch of this family, has not died yet. But she doesn't know because she's been so ill that 2 of her kids have died. That's human interest. That is taking a global pandemic and giving a local or even individual angle on that larger story. All right. Consequence just means, does this event, does this news have an effect on your life? COVID-19 provides another great example of that. The outbreak here has led to a lot of consequences for people's daily lives. Unemployment rates are going to skyrocket if they haven't already, and I genuinely, I can't tell you how much I am sorry if that's affecting you or anyone in your family. But also just the fact that we're doing this, again, through a video lecture. That's an example of consequence. Usefulness is related to this. Usefulness means how is there a possibility that viewers or readers could apply the ideas from this news story into their daily lives. So you might see that again, using coronavirus constantly because it's going to be the biggest story of this year, most likely. You can see this in the news coverage that emphasizes how people can try to stop this spread. Social distancing and the lockdown that began yesterday are great examples of that. That is news that you have to use, essentially. But even stuff like washing your hands, of throwing away your tissues, of staying 6 feet away from each other, that's all useful information that is newsworthy because of its applicability to our everyday lives right now. The next one, novelty, has to do with, is this an unusual circumstance? I am talking to you about all of this from my bedroom. the COVID-19 is extremely novel. This is the first time in a century that America has dealt with a pandemic outbreak to this degree. And so just the pure strangeness of colleges being shut down, of cities closing up their businesses, of just the absolute absence of humanity in so many places where it's usually swarming, it's extremely novel. And then deviance is related to novelty. Deviance is just a question, is this something that is both unusual and bad? The people who are suffering from coronavirus, it's novel that they are sick when they would not have been sick if this disease hadn't jumped into humans, but it's also deviant. It's a little weird to say that, but it's deviant because they are very ill and could potentially die. It's not only unusual, it's potentially calamitous, and that would be an example of deviance. Okay? So that's our characteristics of news, those criteria. The more a story meets these criteria, the more criteria that are met, the more newsworthy it is, the bigger the story it is. The coronavirus meets all of them to one degree or another, hence it being basically the only thing in the news for the past 10 days or so here, for good reason, for very good reason, of course. All right, now, beyond that, there's a lot of other questions that journalists have to think about when they are collecting information, when they are reporting, editing, presenting information. This gets into the topic of neutrality. Here in the United States, the expectation is that our news media is supposed to be unbiased. It is not supposed to favor one side of an issue over the other, but merely present information and let consumers decide for themselves about these issues. It's worth excuse me. It's worth noting that was not the origins of the news media. News media began as extremely partisan. The Chicago Tribune was essentially the Abraham Lincoln newspaper in the 1860s. I wish I still liked their politics that much. But eventually news media companies adopted neutrality as a way of appealing across the aisle, appealing to as many people as possible, and maximizing their potential sales. So in order to do that, there are methods that journalists use in order to appear neutral and unbiased. And they often have to do with how they present information. So the textbook, again, and this is all on page 452, 453 that I'm looking at right here, but the textbook does a pretty good job of mentioning some of these. There's a concept called the inverted pyramid news lead. What that means is, imagine a upside down triangle. Looks kind of like, there we go. Looks like I'm flashing signs. But the inverted pyramid is an upside down triangle. The most important information, the basis of the story, who, what, where, when, how, that goes at the top. That is the first thing you're supposed to know. After that, you have supporting quotations, you have background information, these sorts of things getting less and less important until the story concludes. I will say typically the one part of the inverted pyramid that doesn't get included but is worth mentioning is that journalists do tend to like having very, very intriguing or very powerful starts and conclusions. Typically in written news media, at least, the conclusion of a story is called the kicker. And that's usually something that is intended to make the reader go, oh, really kind of summarize it in a powerful way. And that would still be considered neutral to do that. The other things that you do, you have careful attribution of sources. You always make it very clear where you're getting your information from, ideally name and title. So sometimes that's very easy. If you've been watching the press conferences about coronavirus from the White House, there's no doubt who is speaking. It's President Trump or Vice President Pence, Secretary what's his name, Alex Alazar, Dr. Fauci. You know, name and title right off the top there. Sometimes, though, you get information from people who might want to protect themselves a little bit. So maybe you don't say Dr. Fauci, but you say a prominent, well-known public figure in the infectious disease field. You don't give name, you don't get official title, but you get a sense of who they are. This is done to protect sources. Journalists will oftentimes not want to give away name and title because that could get that person in trouble, and so they will cloak them in anonymity. And that's something that has to be agreed upon by both the reporter and their editor and the source themselves. It is worth noting, ideally for us as news consumers, we want to know name and title every time. It is not possible to know name and title every time. It just circumstantial. The other stuff that journalists do in order to appear neutral, they try not to use adverbs and adjectives, modifying words. You would never, in a pure news report, see a reporter say, President Trump said brilliantly, or President Trump said horribly, or President Trump said stupidly. All of those ly words, they influence the perception of the events, and so journalists try to stay away from them in order to maintain their neutrality. They would just say, President Trump said, begin quotation. Your interpretation would then be up to you. News analysis doesn't do this, perhaps, but pure reporting is supposed to. And then the last aspect of this is that reporters are supposed to use what's called a third-person point of view. They act like they did not actually witness these things. And sometimes they don't witness these things, but a reporter covering a press conference would never cover that in their reporting by saying, well, I saw Dr. Fauci say this. They would say, Dr. Fauci then said, quotation, right? They remove themselves as spectators because when we are hearing firsthand accounts, it maybe is a little more personal. That can also raise suspicions. It can raise doubts about just how accurate this reporting actually is. Now, all of that being said, there is an extremely common perception that the news media is biased, that it is not neutral, and that it favors perhaps a political party or political figures, or it just has a bias. And I think there is probably a fair degree of truth to that, but I would say that by and large, the reason we have a perception of bias in the news media is because of our own inherent biases. Especially if you follow politics closely, you tend to have very strong feelings on the news about what happens and about the people that are involved in them. And so if you are a Democratic voter who follows the news media, odds are pretty good that any reporting that makes President Trump looks good will not be your favorite reporting. That's our own inherent personal biases. And that's a difficult thing to disconnect ourselves from. Obviously, all of us are living our own lives. We have subjective experiences and we have personal opinions about the world and how it operates, and the news media can't change that. Now, that being said, I do think that most news media sources, you can figure out their level of bias. There are sources of information that are neutral, that are mainstream, and if they veer in one political direction or another, it tends to be relatively minor. And these are often the older forms of mass media, national news networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. They tend to be pretty right down the middle in terms of their lack of bias. Old print news sources as well, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they all have some degree of slight leans, but not really. These are institutions, if that makes sense. They're used to reporting on both sides of the aisle, as it is, Democratic or Republican, that sort of thing. They tend to be more suspicious of the fringe figures, the right-wing Republicans or left-wing Democrats, than they are of anybody in the middle, so to speak. And that does present problems, I think, to some degree. But you can also find news sources that are more or less transparently partisan. Fox News is an example of that. Fox News is essentially the PR wing of the Republican Party at this point. There's a Fox News host named Sean Hannity who gives regular nightly advice to President Trump after President Trump watches Sean Hannity's news program. Same is true of Tucker Carlson, another Fox News host. It's mind-boggling. And you can find the same on the other side of the spectrum as well. MSNBC tends to be like a mainstream Democrats news source. maybe not all that into like the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party, but there's also news sources that cater to the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. Jacobin Magazine is a great example of that. And so there's a document I'll upload onto Brightspace under course resources that does a really interesting job. It organizes news media sources, and this is a little bit of subjective judgment, but there is some interesting sort of a rubric they used. But essentially, they try to organize news sources based on both how high the quality of the reporting is, as well as how prominent their political leanings are. And at the center, at the top, is stuff that is fact-based reporting. There is no, not even a hint of analysis or bias, and that has no political leaning in any direction. The two sources there are the Associated Press and Reuters, newswire services. I'll let you take a look at the rest of that, but it is interesting to note that there is both better news in terms of the quality of the reporting or the quality of the analysis. There's also much more partisan news, stuff that is much more inherently against the other side of the political issues inherent to the news. I'll let you take a look at that for yourself, like I said. The last thing I wanted to mention is that there are also biases that are not necessarily political, but which are cultural or social. And that has to do with who journalists are. Journalists tend to be folks who are raised in the suburbs, who get college educations, who come from fairly well-off families. And that's not universally true, but just as a thing, journalism is a profession of the upper middle class, if you want to put it that way. Not that they're necessarily paid well, but they reflect that point of view. And so there are some biases that reporters and editors tend to have that they might not be all that aware of. The textbook does a pretty good job laying this out. This video is already running over 20 minutes, so I do want to cut myself off a little bit here. But really quickly, the four most prominent cultural biases of American reporters are ethnocentrism. They think that the American way of doing things, especially the white suburban way of doing things, is the best, and everything else must be different or strange and almost certainly worse. There's also responsible capitalism. This is the idea that businesses do not exist to make a profit and all other consequences be damned. They exist in order to make lives better. That the rising tide of corporate revenues will lift all boats. I have some issues with that particular outlook there. There's also small-town pastoralism, or even just pastoralism, period. This is a really common American cultural value, but reporters tend to cling on to it quite a bit as well. This is a belief that big cities are inherently bad, that suburbs are better than cities, and the best is country life, living in a small town or out on a farm. And you can see that bias in a wide variety of ways. My favorite example the past couple of years is I forget how long ago it was, but there was this new drug that was, I think it was created in Russia, if I'm recalling correctly, called Crocodile, which apparently was just injecting gasoline into your bloodstream. It sounded absolutely ghastly. And the first case of it that happened in Illinois was in Joliet, which is not a small town, but it is definitely a lot smaller than Chicago. And I remember there's a story about Crocodile getting people sick and hospitalized and even, I think, killing a few people in Joliet. And the reporter covering it said, Joliet might not be the smallest town, but it usually doesn't have big city problems like this. And it was just like, there had been no reported cases of crocodile usage in Chicago. And in fact, if you look at national drug problems, the places dealing with it the most are rural. It's Appalachia. It's the countryside where you see horrible consequences of painkillers and stuff like that being abused. And so that's pastoralism, that this is presented as a city problem that got exported to the country rather than just a human problem that pops up wherever humans are. The last of these cultural values is individualism. This is another very common American belief that that people are responsible for themselves, and that everybody looks out for themselves before anyone else. There's a huge variety of ways that pops up in news media, but it's particularly prominent in the news media because reporters see themselves as individuals. They often work alone. They have to compete with one another for scoops and stuff like that, and so that tends to influence their perception and their reporting quite a bit. All right, this has run 25 minutes. Thank you for putting up with it if you lasted this long, and I will see you next week.